All right, Jeff, the floor is yours once again.
Thank you, Carla, and thanks to Cam McNeil for inviting me to present today, and thanks to all of you folks who are attending as delegates. If we could have the slide deck up, you'll see that today what I'm going to be doing is talking about the industrial bioeconomy. So we're not going to be speaking about biopharmaceuticals, which is another whole exciting area. We're going to be talking just about the industrial bioeconomy revolution and asking the question whether or not Canada is ready or if we're going to be standing on the sidelines. So let's go to the next slide. And first of all, I just want to ask everybody that if you heard that Canada was sitting on an untapped $200 billion sustainable economic development opportunity that was going to drive activity in forestry, agriculture, and municipal solid waste, wouldn't you want to hear more? And so that's that's what we're going to talk about, and I'll explain how we got or where we got that $200 billion figure from. But first, let's go to the next slide and just to make sure we understand what the industrial bioeconomy is. So the International Energy Agency refers to the industrial bioeconomy as the production of products and materials from the sustainable processing of biomass. So pretty straightforward, turning trees and crops and grasses, either residue or dedicated crops and grasses, into renewable products and materials. On the next slide, you'll see that the U.S. Department of Agriculture defines bio-based products as derived from plants and other renewable agriculture, marine, and forestry materials that provide an alternative to conventional petroleum-derived products. So the next slide says it really simply: hydrocarbons down, carbohydrates up. What we're talking about here in the industrial bioeconomy is a lot of the stuff, probably 90% of what you and I consume, from fuels to bioenergy for heat and electricity to chemicals, could have that are derived from hydrocarbons, could instead be derived from carbohydrates or biomass. So on the next slide, we'll just go into a little more depth. What are we actually talking about? I think everybody knows about renewable fuels. Ethanol is in all gasoline in Canada, except parts of perhaps Atlantic Canada, but right across the country. Back in the day when we thought mandates were the way to proceed, actually Ontario and Saskatchewan were two of the first provinces. Ontario mandated ethanol in gasoline in 2007, and then finally the feds caught up in 2010. And so those of you who are old enough to remember the days when we used to have to put gasoline antifreeze in our cars, you'd buy a little tube like about the 2 or 3 ounces of gasoline antifreeze to prevent your gasoline from freezing during the winter. Well, nobody has done that now for 15 or more years, because of course that's what gasoline antifreeze was ethanol. And all gasoline sold in Canada has got up to 10% blend in it. And of course, bioenergy, just burning wood for heat and electricity, not the best use of biomass, but certainly if you're a First Nation and you're currently flying in diesel fuel while being surrounded by forest, it might be better to have a biomass boiler to generate heat and electricity. And then the exciting stuff, I think, are what's going on in biochemicals, paints, plastics, everything, cosmetics, industrial cleaners, laundry detergent. I mean, you name it. It could be, instead of coming from hydrocarbons, come from carbohydrates. And if you were to Google bio-preferred, it would pop up right away. There's a U.S. Department of Agriculture program called the bio-preferred program and I've got on this slide 14,000 items. It's constantly increasing, so it may well be more than 14,000 items now. But this program was introduced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture way back in 2002. And if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more. We have to go to the next slide, please.
Sorry, technical issues.
Okay, so this is what a refinery, a biorefinery would look like. It's very similar to an oil refinery. Basically, you'd have biomass coming in. It says on this slide, because I borrowed it from Ashland, agriculture biomass, but it could also be forestry biomass. In fact, in Canada, it's most likely to be forestry, making high volume, low margin fuels. And then, of course, the sugars that are found in biomass, because that's what biomass is cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin. But the cellulose and hemicellulose can be turned into fermentable sugars. And then those sugars, once you've got sugar, you can ferment it and distill it to make alcohol, and you can make any number of items out of the sugar solution. So that's what a biorefinery would look like, similar to an oil refinery. High volume, low margin fuels mixed together with low volume, high margin specialty chemicals. Next slide. So, is Canada prepared for the bio-revolution? Well, there's about 30 countries in the world that have national bioeconomy strategies, and we're not among them. But with 348 million hectares of forest, about 9% actually of the world's forest, and 60 million hectares of ag land, and a whole bunch of municipalities that no longer allow organic waste to be landfilled, like Toronto and Vancouver and so on, then it's completely counterintuitive that we do not have a national bioeconomy strategy, or at least perhaps as a subset of a national low carbon strategy of which the bioeconomy would be part. Next slide. So here's Canada's forest cover. We've got plenty. This is 348 million hectares. It's larger than almost every country in Europe. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see who's responsible. Well, I'm sure everybody on this call knows that Canada's forests are owned by the Crown. So 94% of Canada's forests are publicly owned and managed by provincial governments. There's a small number of forests that are owned by the federal government. You can see there in the yellow, 4%, but 90% are owned by the provinces and territories. And then some are privately owned. So why am I putting this slide up? Because if we're thinking about a national bioeconomy strategy or a forest bioeconomy strategy, even if we don't include agriculture, then the provincial governments have the opportunity to drive this forward, because they sign long-term forest management agreements with the private sector to manage forests sustainably. And if you don't do that, then you don't get your license renewed. Well, provincial governments could move forward in this space and insist that we add more value to our wood products. Of course, there have to be consumer demand. And one of the ways to increase consumer demand would be if federal government, or if not federal, then provincial governments created a bio-preferred program similar to the one in the US, where I didn't mention, by the way, that in addition to those 14,000 items, the US bio-preferred program requires federal government purchasing. So you can imagine how much demand that creates for, and how much market pull that creates, because the US government includes the military. So that creates a lot of market pull for bio-based products and materials. And there's no reason why Canada couldn't do the same, except that I've been talking to Agriculture Canada for more than 15 years about copying the US one, and there's never been any interest or uptake. When I was speaking at last year's Scaling Up to the Minister of Forests, who came and spoke at Scaling Up, I mentioned to him that we haven't been able to get any traction with the federal government, and the minister, who is recently reelected in the Ontario election here, the Ford government, said, we're not waiting for Ottawa to do anything, we'll just do it ourselves. Well, that's exactly what happened with the ethanol mandates, that Ontario mandated ethanol and gasoline in 2007, and then it took the feds 3 more years to get around to copying what Ontario and, as I mentioned before, Saskatchewan had done. I'll go to the next slide. So this is on the ag side. You saw where the forests are, and where the agriculture isn't, the forests are. Alberta, you can tell from this map, is 60% covered in forest. That the other 40% is agriculture. Same with Saskatchewan, 60% covered in forests. So those provinces that are so heavily reliant on oil and gas could diversify their economy into value-added biomass products and materials, and discover the future by not looking in the rearview mirror. Next slide. So what's the size of the prize? What am I actually talking about here? Well, according to the McKinsey report that came out in May of 2020 called The Bio-Revolution, Innovations Transforming Economy, Society, and Our Lives, the direct economic impact of the revolution would be $4 trillion a year. Now, when I first read that figure, I read 4 trillion. Well, that's a big number. But then I read a year. We're not talking about 4 trillion totally. And half of that direct impact, in other words, 2 trillion, more than 2 trillion, could be outside human health. In other words, not biopharma, which I mentioned in the beginning that we're not talking about, in domains like agriculture, food, consumer products and services, materials, and energy. So we're talking about a 2 trillion minimum opportunity, 2 trillion a year. And I said, well, there's no reason why Canada can't capture 10% of that. We've got 9% of the world's forests and another 60 million hectares of ag land. So 10% of 2 trillion is 200 billion. So that's where the number comes from. And if you go to the next slide, there are people who think McKinsey is actually quite conservative in its estimates. So the Canadian foresight says that we have a unique opportunity in forestry, pulp and paper, and agriculture. And this would be projected to be $7.7 trillion opportunity by 2030 and 240 billion in Canada alone. So my estimate is considered conservative by foresight. And if you go to the next slide, this is a little bit older estimate, but way back in 2009, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, estimated that by 2025, the world's bioeconomy would be between 2.6 and 5.8 trillion. And it already is very much, it's in that space already. And according to Nature magazine, global trade in agriculture, forestry, food, bioenergy, biotechnology is already at the US 2 trillion in 2014. So we don't have some current numbers, unless that's a typo, but I don't think we had the numbers for 2024. I can't remember, but it's a big business. And Canada is, it's not that companies in Canada, in the lack of a national bioeconomy strategy, are doing nothing. There are Canadian companies that are active. Carla mentioned that I used to work for 12 years as executive VP at Iogen Corporation. Well, they've pivoted into renewable natural gas. Now, most of the work that they're doing is with U.S. companies, but there are Canadian companies who are active in the bioeconomy, in part because they can make money doing it, but also the U.S. Department of Agriculture's BioPreferred program is not limited to American companies. You can be an offshore company and still get listed in their catalog as a Canadian company. Next slide, please. So, how is all this happening? Well, it's happening because of biology and breakthroughs in the science of biology, but also advances in computing, data analytics, machine learning, AI. Everybody's talking about AI these days. So, basically, biology is increasingly being used to create all these novel materials that I've been talking about, from paints and plastic to cosmetics to industrial cleaners and solvents and so on, introducing entirely new capabilities that are biodegradable and emit significantly less carbon. So one of the other advantages of the bioeconomy is not just economic opportunities for rural communities in forestry and agriculture, but it could help Canada meet our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And we're a member of a signatory to the Paris Agreement. So this is how the bio revolution is happening. I do recommend anybody who wants to read more of that McKinsey Global Institute study from 2020. And next slide. So are we stuck again? There we go. Some of you might be old enough to remember the movie The Graduate. And in that movie, the fellow that has the balloon saying biology and pointing his finger at Dustin Hoffman was saying plastics, because Dustin Hoffman had just graduated from university and didn't know what to get into. Well, I'm saying that the message for graduating students of 2025 is not plastics, it's biology. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that 10 years from now, I don't think students should be planning to be working in the oil and gas sector. They need to be getting degrees in those things that I've got there: chemistry, chemical engineering, biological sciences, biological engineering, even marketing and communications, because individuals with these degrees could readily find employment and add considerable value to the industrial bioeconomy. Now, there are all kinds of people, by the way, working in the oil and gas sector that already have these degrees. And so there would be the possibility for a transition from them working in the oil and gas sector to them working in the industrial bioeconomy. And companies in this space could definitely use their expertise and talents. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see that how is Canada doing? Well, I've already mentioned our resources. We've got the 348 million hectares. The pulp market's collapsed, so we need new markets. Last year at the Scaling Up conference, one of our keynote speakers was the chief forester for Renfrew County. Renfrew County is the largest county in Ontario. It's just up the Ottawa Valley from where I live here in Ottawa. And the forester, a woman named Lacey Rose, was pleading with the audience, please, please create more demand for forest products. We have so much low grade and waste wood in Canada, and in her case, in Renfrew County. And if we could create more demand for forest biomass, then we would help to reduce forest fires. So that's another benefit of all of this, is not just economic development and job creation and environmental benefits, but let's use all that low grade wood. Nobody here is talking about cutting down old growth sequoia forests. We're talking about low grade wood that could be used as feedstock and help prevent forest fires. So we'll go to the next slide. I mean, I was quite amazed actually at her plea, Lacey Rose's plea for more demand. So are we competing? Well, what are our trading partners doing? So I've already mentioned the US's BioPreferred program, but it came out with its National Bioeconomy Blueprint in 2011-2012 in the Obama administration. And then the Office of Science and Technology Policy released bold goals. So in September of 2022, then President Biden came out with an executive order on the bioeconomy and biomanufacturing in the U.S. And what he did in that executive order was give federal departments, he wanted an all-of-government approach. So U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Commerce, Defense. There were 6 or 8 different departments involved. And he gave them 6 months to come up with bold goals for U.S. biomanufacturing. Now, that bold goals document still exists, but as far as the executive order is concerned, anything that was an executive order from the Biden administration has been scrubbed from the White House website of the new administration. And so you can no longer find that executive order. And I wish you could, because it was such a articulate, well-written explanation of the biorevolution and how the U.S. was going to be the world leader. And it just almost made me weep with envy, because I've never seen anything like that written in Canada. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see after the 6 months, this is what the U.S. departmental response to the executive order was. In March of 2023, they came out with bold goals for U.S. biotechnology and biomanufacturing. And now, next week, I'm going to be down in Washington there's a conference there every March called the Advanced Bioeconomy Leadership Conference. It's similar to Canada's the Scaling Up Conference that I run here in Ottawa, but I'll get some kind of insights hopefully next week in Washington as to where this all stands with the new administration now, because a lot of the staff who would have been working on this have probably been let go. I mean, even in a normal U.S. administration, as many of you probably know, the top 4 or 5 levels of the bureaucracy are replaced by partisans, not in the way it's been happening under the Trump administration, but it's not similar to Canada, where, you know, when there's a change in government, the deputy ministers on down still stay in their jobs. So it's not completely unusual that some of those people would have been replaced by a new administration, but I hope to have an update after next week's conference. Next slide, please. So this was the departmental response. This is what was in the text of that bold goals document. The world is on the cusp of an industrial revolution fueled by biotechnology and biomanufacturing, and it provides an alternative to petroleum-based products for chemicals, medicines, fuels, materials, and more. Whether that's of any interest to the new administration, as I said, I'll find out next week. But this could be seen as a huge opportunity for Canada, because if the U.S. happens to drop the ball on this file, we have a huge opportunity to pick up that ball and do business with our other trading partners in Europe and the Pacific. Next slide, please. So, support government procurement and bioproducts. Okay, so I talked about this, give you a little bit more detail. The Farm Bill was introduced in 2002, and then it was expanded in 2018. And I mentioned 4,000 items. So where's Canada's BioPreferred program? Well, we don't have one. So let's go to the next slide. And so is Canada competing? Well, how about our trading partners other than the U.S.? So the European Commission in 2012 and 2018 came up with its updated bioeconomy strategy, knowledge for policy. So that's the European Commission, but individual countries within the EU have national strategies, and they're listed there: Austria, Finland, France, Germany. I mean, name them all. And then, as well as those in Europe, there's Argentina, Brazil, China. I mean, even China has a national bioeconomy strategy. Well, maybe I shouldn't say even China, India, Japan, and so on, Portugal, South Africa, Thailand. So if you go to the next slide, I've got a little quiz for us. Guess which country? This government announced a national bioeconomy strategy, and this is taken out of their document. The purpose is to make the bioeconomy one of the pillars for productive transformation by promoting innovation, value addition. You remember I talked about adding value to Canada's wood, diversification and sophistication of our economy, applying the principles of the circular bioeconomy, and seeking the decarbonization of production and consumption processes. Wouldn't that be something, eh? But which country came up with that? Go to the next slide. Costa Rica. Shouldn't Canada be embarrassed? I mean, it's incredible, you know, and that was in August 2020 that Costa Rica came up with that statement. And productive systems face challenges to produce more efficiently or reinvent themselves, maintain value chains that support jobs and livelihoods, while the sustainable use and rehabilitation of nature are ensured in the face of climate change. Now, I know Costa Rica has a reputation for being an environmental leader, but still, the fact that that little country can come up with such a profound statement and targets, it's kind of, I'm a bit embarrassed that Canada hasn't got anything comparable. And when I travel, as I do, giving speeches in Europe and the US, people ask me why we don't have such a strategy. Next slide. So let's be a little bit fair here. In 2019, there was a group of forestry and bioeconomy enthusiasts that took the initiative and presented the government of Canada with something called Canada's bioeconomy strategy. So they had consultation sessions in 6 different locations across Canada. I went to the one in Montreal, and everybody had ideas about what the challenges and so on are. And they produced this document and threw it over the fence to the government. And there's never been a response. And that was in 2019. Next slide. So also, to be fair, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers came out with something called the Forest Bioeconomy Framework. So not involving agriculture and not a strategy, but a framework. And they renewed that 2017 framework in 2022. And it identified a whole bunch of challenges and suggested actions. And I'm not going to list all the challenges. They listed probably a dozen of them. But on the next slide, the one that I pulled out is that the environmental reputation of the forest sector and communicating the benefits of the forest bioeconomy. I think that is spot on in terms of one of the challenges that the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers acknowledged. And the action they recommended was to continue to support scientific and economic analysis and demonstration projects that seek to validate the range of expected economic, social, and environmental benefits of the forest bioeconomy. So, is that happening? To a small degree, but funnily enough, one of the biggest issues or barriers we have in Canada is the Federal Environment and Climate Change Department, ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada. There are a whole lot of people in that department who think that you can't cut down a single tree. And the best way for us to preserve our forests would be to properly manage them, and that includes harvesting. So let's go to the next slide. Here's an example. Every 80 to 100 years, Canada's forests are renewed either by wildfires, pests, or harvest. Well, I think we would prefer harvest to wildfires and pests, especially the fires. And we don't count in our greenhouse gas emission inventory in Canada any of the greenhouse gases from forest fires. If we did, we would have more than double the amount of emissions attributed to Canada. Next slide. So, enhancing forest health and protecting communities. So we need to thin, dense, aging forests to reduce the intensity of wildfires and cut down trees to make fire breaks, to remove that combustible material around forested communities. If we'd done that in Jasper, we wouldn't have had that whole horrible disaster that Jasper had in terms of a fire a couple of years ago. Next slide. Comprehensive action plan to grow the sector and markets for low-grade wood, show leadership through green procurement. That's what the federal government could do. and let's get moving on investment tax credits for biomass. Back in, I don't remember if it was budget 2023, I think, came out with tax credits for a whole bunch of renewable energy, and they neglected to include bioenergy. Some people felt that was deliberate. Some people felt it was an accident. But in budget 2024, after heavy lobbying by a number of companies and the Forest Products Association of Canada, biomass was included. However, it hasn't yet gone to the implementation stage, and of course now we're in a potential federal election, so we're going to have to get that reintroduced when we have a new government. Next slide. Okay, so here's some good news. Engineered wood products are manufactured for load-bearing wall, floor, and roof construction. I'm sure all of you are familiar with engineered wood products, and they're high strength, just like concrete and steel, but way lighter. And they're a substitute for carbon-intensive building materials like concrete. And you probably may know that BC, Ontario, and Quebec permit mass timber structures up to 12 stories. Vancouver and 13 other BC municipalities have amended their bylaw to allow mass timber construction up to 12 stories. Well, actually, the UBC, I think the residents there, if somebody can correct me on the call here, but I think it's 18 stories. And there are over 480 completed mass timber projects in Canada and 21 mass timber manufacturing facilities, compared to 1,300 mass timber manufacturing facilities in the U.S. So, and there's a document there, the State of Mass Timber in Canada 2021. So that there is some things happening, especially in wood construction. Next slide, please. This tells you just a little bit about, whole tree value, 7 million cubic meters of merchantable fiber opportunity across Ontario, and in Eastern Ontario, where I live, 1.5 million cubic meters. And there's a whole move afoot to get some kind of a mass timber institute located either here in Eastern Ontario or perhaps up in the Thunder Bay area. Next slide. So what's the government role in making this happen? Well, provide capital markets with the right signals to catalyze bio-based investments. So end the tax subsidies and direct cash infusions to oil and gas. The government has been promising to do this for years and years, and they never seem to get around to it. They talk about, well, we'll end the subsidies, but only certain ones. Anyway, that's one starting point. And implement a federal bioproducts procurement program similar to the American one. Expand the definition of Canadian renewable and conservation expenses, CERC. That allows startups to flow through tax deductions to companies that can't actually take advantage of them. So you can flow through shares to rich doctors and hockey players and lawyers. Establish direct incentives to de-risk investment, and encourage Canada's financial institutions and pension funds to invest in low carbon emitting products and materials rather than in the oil and gas sector. I should mention in the second last bullet, biomass development opportunity zones. There's a company based out of Toronto that's called EcoStrat, and they go into a community and do a full assessment of what's the extent of the biomass resource, either agriculture or forestry, how much volume is there, at what cost can it be acquired, what's the local infrastructure in terms of road, rail, water, power, in order to support a bio-manufacturing facility. And they rate that community on a scale of, out of 100 items, you can either get a AA rating, an A rating, a triple B rating, or whatever. And they have identified dozens of bioeconomy development opportunity zones across Canada and the US. So it's very, very good work that they're doing. And why is that important? Because somebody who's thinking about building a plant, and let's say they were going to build a plant in rural Saskatchewan or rural Alberta, down in the Vegreville area, say, where there's lots of cereal straw, then if they had a bioeconomy development opportunity zone rating of A or AA, that would help them attract investment, because some independent party had gone in and said, this is a good place to situate your plant. Next slide, please. So here's something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but the world's largest reinsurance company, Munich Re, is including bioeconomy projects in its portfolio as a hedging strategy to protect existing assets from climate change versus drill, baby, drill. So Munich Re is no longer insuring coal-fired projects, tar sands projects, and any infrastructure associated with tar sands or oil sands projects. Why? Because they are having to pay out huge insurance claims because of extreme weather events. So if you go to the next slide, this basically shows you, we've heard for ages about how you can't decouple GDP from environmental protection. Well, California has disproved this since the early 2000s. You can see there, you've got GDP, population, GHG emissions per capita, and GHG emissions per GDP. And as the GDP has grown, the GHG emissions per GDP has continually gone down. One of the reasons for that is they don't just have aggressive targets, they have milestones that have to be met. Canada always established, we're going to meet, 25%, whatever, reduction by 2035. We're going to be XYZ percent below the Kyoto targets or the Paris targets or whatever. But we never meet those targets because there are no milestones in the intervening years. Whereas in California, every year there's a milestone. Every single year, companies have to meet these targets. So this is why they're getting the result that they're getting. Next slide, please. So here's the message that McKinsey gave to us as Canadians, okay? Canadian stakeholders and contributors need to inform themselves about the bio-revolution. We need to become bio-literate. I just love that phrase. And so if anybody was to ask me in the Q&A period, why is this happening in Canada and why aren't we having a bioeconomy strategy? Well, we're not bio-literate. But I've been spending, and here's Cam McNeil also who invited me to address you today. We've been talking for decades about the opportunities here, but somehow the message isn't getting through. Maybe because we're so blessed in Canada with natural resources, whether it's oil, gas, hydroelectricity, uranium, potash, and we've just become complacent given how blessed we are. But we're also blessed with forestry and agriculture, and can turn those into much higher value added products to then export to the rest of the world. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay, summary. Futures biology, we've got enormous resources. There's a growing unwillingness to insure fossil. Government policy can direct capital allocations. So let's go to the next slide, because I've got a couple of, transitioning away from hydrocarbons, it's going to be challenging, but the challenges shouldn't be the result of public ignorance or myopia. And we need a national low carbon strategy that includes the bioeconomy. And here's the thing, if we stand on the sidelines, Canadians will be forced to consume bio-based products and materials made offshore. Think vaccines. So we'll be importing all these products and materials and exporting the jobs. Let's go to the next slide. I've got a couple of parting thoughts. Certainty is the mother of investment. Well, yeah, guess what? In this trade war that we're in right now, sure proves that statement, because we don't have certainty and investment is dried up. So let's go to the next slide. Capital allocates itself, okay? Or said another way, capital pursues the path of least resistance. So it goes where it can generate the highest rate of return at the lowest possible risk. So we have to ask ourselves, has government created a strong and reliable investment incentives to drive capital to achieve their desired policy outcomes? And if one of their desired policy outcomes is, economic growth, job creation, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth, then they need to put in place the investment incentives that'll drive capital to achieve those policy outcomes, one of which would be in the industrial bioeconomy. Let's go to the next slide. Insurance drives commerce. So I mentioned about Munich Re. So as weather events create ever-growing insurance claims, insurance will either go out of business, well, obviously that's not their preferred option, stop providing coverage, which is already happening, and substantially increase coverage rates. So in other words, can you still afford to get insurance for your facility? Okay, so without insurance, capital projects just don't proceed unless you happen to be, Royal Dutch Shell and can finance a $400 billion facility off your balance sheet. Let's go to the next slide. Sorry, 400 million, not billion. So as a practical matter, suppose that you have a new technology that is ready for commercialization. Debt financing is going to be the biggest challenge that you're going to face. You're going to need to raise money in the form of equity and debt. And to raise that money, you're going to have to convince a lender that the project risk can be managed. Will the technology work? Will it be completed on time and on performance? What about feedstock risk? Have you got a guaranteed supply of feedstock at a fixed price over a period of time? And then do you have an off-taker for whatever it is? If you're producing, have you got a customer? Scale-up risk. You need an independent engineering analysis for that, because a lot of people in the new technology space thought they could skip the demonstration phase and go from pilot to commercial. And guess what? They crashed and burned. You have to scale up gradually. You've got your fundamental research, your applied research, your pilot plant, then a demo plant, then your first commercial, and then full-scale commercial rollout. So lenders are going to assess the risk and then price the debt accordingly. And they're going to say, well, what interest rate do I need to charge these guys if their facility only operates at 65% capacity factor, not at 95%? And the greater the perceived risk is, the higher the cost of debt. So if your project isn't financeable, you need to lower the perceived risk. Let's go to the last slide. I think it's the last one. Well, this is just a picture of what I've been talking about. At the Scaling Up conference 2 years ago, I asked an artist who knew nothing about the industrial bioeconomy to sit in the room for a day and a half and draw a picture of what she thought she heard. And this is what she heard. There's Canada really good at research and development. Down there in the bottom of that thing where the little beaver is running, trying to go faster and further to get up to that $2 trillion opportunity where you already see bags of money in China and other countries like the US there. And we've got all that forestry and agriculture up in the upper left-hand corner, but we need certainty in order to, and government policy in order to get up that slope. Next slide. Yeah, so you want to learn more, you can come to the 10th Annual Bioeconomy Conference here in Ottawa, November 12th to 14th. Okay, I think I used up my time, and maybe more than my time. Sorry if I went over time, Carla.
It's no problem at all. We still have some time for Q&A. Thank you so much for that very informative webinar, Jeff. And Jeff's contacts are here, and we can also share them post webinar if anybody is interested. All right, at this point, we'll welcome some questions from the audience. Feel free to type your question in the chat, or please use the raise your hand function to ask a question.
Or all right,
Michael Wiggin, you're first.
Is that the Michael Wiggin that I have known for decades?
Yeah, that's me.
Boy, and you're always getting letters to the editor published in the Ottawa Citizen.
That too.
I can't believe how many of your letters. Do you know somebody on the inside there?
No, I just sheer volume.
You write a good letter, obviously.
Thanks. Well, anyhow, yeah, like you, Jeff, hopefully I'm still active and contributing something useful. Mainly, I've worked with some guys in Boltzmann Institute now, working on thermal networks and tied into various sources, including biomass. My question to you is, I have been working with Leo Hall and some people in the Valley on the biomass resource, and they suggest that the closure of local mills has eliminated the sustainable market for about 12 million tons a year of biomass for chips. Now there's residue from sawmill, but there's also trees with red rot that are stockpiled in the forest as well. You, in your introduction, you kind of said, well, biomass heating's okay, but there's better things to do. In Eastern Ontario, the government system could consume at least 100,000 tons a year, but that's such a tiny dent in what's potentially available. I was just wondering if you could tell us your position on biomass use for heat and power.
No, I think it's a good use. We should use, first of all, as you point out, we have got so much biomass. So, and I think if you look at the model of an oil refinery, you're not going to be able to use up all that biomass just by making lipstick. So or other specialty chemicals. Like you're not going to use all that biomass. making personal care products, or paints. So there's going to be lots of biomass to also be used for heat and electricity, and especially if it's district energy. I mean, way more about that, Michael, than I do. But what I was struck by was, and you probably know Lacey Rose, do you? The chief forester for Renfrew County?
No, I don't know him personally, but I talk to Leo Hall a lot.
No, Lacey is a woman.
Yeah.
And
No.
she is, so she was the one, and I was really struck by her. It's just anecdotally here. So she used to be a tree hugger, and she was born and brought up in Labrador. And she always gave her father heck for cutting down trees. And she walked us through her evolution from you can't cut down trees to what she described as, I'm still a tree hugger, but I believe now in proper forest management, and how she went through that evolution, and then pleading for anybody in the audience who could create more demand for forest products. And I had never heard a message put quite that way before. So yeah, there's lots of biomass around, and I'm sorry if I gave the impression. What I was trying to say when I said, well, it's maybe not the greatest use for biomass is to just burn it for heat and electricity, but obviously, if you can add more value, I mean, in an oil refinery with the high volume, low margin gasoline, they make about and that would eat up, and not just gasoline, but diesel and aviation fuel and everything else, making up about 90% or more of the barrel. They make the same amount of money off that as they make off the other 10% of the barrel selling specialty chemicals, because the margins are so much higher. People will pay $10 for some personal care products that cost 75 cents to make. But like I say, you'll never use all the biomass available just making personal care products.
Yeah.
So
right,
yes, we've got lots of biomass for heat and electricity.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
We'll talk another time on this stuff.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? We have time for one more. We can put it in the chat, or if somebody would like to raise their hand. I have one for you, Jeff, and then we will share with everybody about some information about the next one. You had mentioned that Canada doesn't have a national bioeconomy strategy, and you did share with us those that do. Why do you think we don't have one yet?
Well, I tried to suggest that a little bit. And as I mentioned, back in 2019, there were a bunch of industry people that got together and wrote an industry national bioeconomy strategy, and then threw it over the fence to the government, which is not what you really should do. You have to go in and constantly lobby, but the people who put it together didn't have the resources to constantly lobby. And as I say, I was just provided input at one of the 6 meetings they had. So, and to be fair, the Canadian Forest Service of Natural Resources Canada has what they call a forest bioeconomy framework, which again is, and good on them for having that. It doesn't seem to have got much in the way of traction. I don't know whether it's a federal, provincial, jurisdictional thing or what. Although I will say that one of the things they identified as a challenge in that forest bioeconomy framework was the need, or the potential need, for standards for claiming bio-based content. And so the Canadian Standards Association took that up, and they just had a workshop here in Ottawa on the 13th of February, which I helped them organize, on exactly that. What should the criteria be for companies that want to claim bio-based content as a marketing strategy? And should there be voluntary standards that the CSA would develop in concert with industry to help move that along? So there is stuff happening, Carla, but it just seems that we're so complacent and so blessed with other resources, and energy is inexpensive, and we've got so much, as I mentioned before, oil and gas and uranium and hydroelectric and whatever, that we just haven't. We don't educate our kids either. So here's another. I'm sorry if I'm jumping around here, but last year every year at Scaling Up we have a feature country. Last year it was Finland. By the way, this year it's going to be Brazil. I think I have a meeting next week with the Brazilian ambassador to Canada here in Ottawa next Monday. But Finland last year. So I said to the Finns, what do you think of Canada's forest management practices, and how come you guys are so engaged in forestry? And now, of course, Finland's a much smaller country, but what they said to us was, from the time children go to school, they get educated in forest management, like forestry. Forestry is in their DNA. And I don't like, I mean, all we hear about if you go to school was, oh, it's bad to cut down a tree. Like that's the message we get. We don't hear anything about the benefits of forestry. And so it's not in our education system. Provincial governments own the forest. They could certainly, and they're responsible for education. They could certainly put it in there. And then as far as forest management practices are concerned, I asked again the Finns what they thought of Canada's forest management practices. They said, well, you're about 30 years behind Finland. Okay, well, again, they manage their forest properly because they have created enough demand. Let's acknowledge, of course, that there are many Canadian forests that don't even have roads into them. So it's not like we can have access to all of our forests, but I just think we're too complacent, and I need to do a better job as Jeff Passmore informing the Liberal government or whoever is going to be the next government. Maybe I need to get into Mark Carney's office and say, listen, this should be part of your election policy platform or something like that. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We are out of time, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And please join me in thanking Jeff once again for joining us and giving us this in a very informative webinar. Very much appreciated, Jeff. Yes, thank you. I'm going to echo. Here we go. There we go.
You.
Thank you. Just to let everybody know that the next webinar is scheduled for April 15th. And we have Michael Wigan, who will be presenting. Before we go, Tim, I see you have your hand up. Oh, I think maybe we were just giving you a thank you there. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all a wonderful week, and we'll see you all back here on April 15th for the next webinar of the McNeil Energy Speaker Series with Michael Wigan, and you will receive the invitation along with the poster advertisement tomorrow morning. Thank you all. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Cam.
Great, terrific.
Thanks a lot.